Okay, welcome, first of all, to another installment of our fall evening at Egan lecture series. It's wonderful to have such a great turnout tonight for Dr. Nazif Shahrani, who is coming to us from the Department of Central Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Indiana in Bloomington. Dr. Shahrani was educated, well, he was born and raised and partly educated, at least, in Afghanistan before coming to the United States, where he received a bachelor's in anthropology from the University of Washington, and then moved on to graduate work, receiving a master's and a PhD from the University of Washington. From there, he's held several postdoctoral fellowships at Harvard, Stanford University. Spent some time in D.C. as well with the Smithsonian and with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And he's been at the University of Indiana for a number of years. Has published extensively on Afghanistan, and I think is going to have some observations whose relevance I probably don't need to underscore. I think the excellent timing of this talk is quite evident to anyone who's decided to come out here tonight. So with that, we'll offer a warm welcome to Dr. Shahrani.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening. It's a pleasure to be here this evening with all of you, and before I proceed, I must thank my wonderful friends, Dr. Elaine Schroeder and Dr. Bob Schroeder. They are the people who have actually coaxed me, but pleasantly. I'm glad to be here. They have been responsible and encouraging me, and I'm very happy to be here. And of course, I would like to also thank University of Alaska Southeast and Juneau People for Peace and Justice for their interest in what's going on in Afghanistan. And I also have to start by telling you that 9/11 was indeed a catastrophic event for this country, for all of us, and especially for Muslim Americans, and particularly shortly after that for those who were Afghan Muslim Americans like me. This event had a tremendous impact early on me simply because it questioned very seriously my own personal identity as to who I was and where did my loyalties lie. Having been born in a country where the United States of America, my adopted country, I'm a naturalized citizen of this country since 1991. We're at war. And I had to sort of resolve to myself personally, and I think my other hyphenated compatriots had the same problem. How they resolved it, I don't know. But for me, the early days of post-9/11 in this country was rather shrill in the sense that the media, the government, everybody was promoting American nationalism, while they were talking about patriotism, but they really meant nationalism. And I had to question myself whether I can be an American nationalist. And the answer was no, simply because nationalism demands that one should support one's government's policies, right or wrong. And that's what was expected of us and demanded of us at that time. But there was a resolution, and that was that I resolved that I could be a patriotic American as well as a patriotic Afghan. I couldn't be a nationalist Afghan and a nationalist American. And the difference is that A patriotic Afghan American, anybody, is somebody who would be willing to support those policies of their government that are morally right, and would be willing to stick their neck out and criticize when they find those policies morally unacceptable. So it's in that spirit that I have spoken widely across this country, and this evening I will be critical of both my country of birth, Afghanistan, and its government's policies, and also my adopted country, the United States of America. I'm a proud American, and I hope that I would be patriotic to the core, and the fact that I would be willing to support certain policies that our government has pursued when it is a positive and beneficial policy both to the security of this country as well as the country of my birth, that is Afghanistan. This war has been extremely costly, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with some of these costs. Some of these figures came out in the magazine Nation, I think in its latest edition, which just appeared last week or so. There, they are putting the dollar costs of this war since 2001 to all of us Americans at $223 billion. But the cost annually now, again, with the level of troops that we have, which is around not quite yet 68,000 American soldiers there, will be $65 billion a year. This is incredible when you compare it to one small fact, and that is Afghanistan from 1955 to 1975, over 20 years, at the time when the Cold War was at its height. And Afghanistan was beneficiary of that Cold War because the Soviets were giving money in foreign assistance, and we, the United States of America, was also giving money to that country. During that 20-year period, the total amount of foreign assistance given to that country was $2.2 billion. $2.2 billion. The corrupt government of that era had used that amount of money to build some schools, clinics, roads, and everything else, which of course got destroyed in the last 30 years. But imagine this amount of money being spent in that country. Somebody was actually, recently I was in Australia, and somebody was jokingly telling me, with this kind of cost, you know, every Afghan subject, citizen, whatever you want to call, could be a millionaire if this money was in fact given to everybody in cash. But that's not what has happened. And the sad part of it is that although this money, our taxpayers' money, has been spent, it has not been spent in Afghanistan. Not all of it. In fact, a very small portion of it. While it is tagged as the cost of war in Afghanistan, but in fact, other people are enriched by this, and often service institutions as such. But aside from money, what concerns us and should concern all of us, and I'm sure some of you who are in the audience also have loved ones in Afghanistan fighting, that we have lost 850 plus American lives already. This month, October, has been the deadliest month of the war. More than 45, 50 people. I have not, again, kept up. The last few days has been even worse in terms of loss of life. American lives, young American lives, have been lost in this. And of course, it will get worse, not better, given the path that's being followed. And the number of US soldiers, 68,000, is now being asked to be increased by possibly 40,000 more. That will bring it to over 100,000 American soldiers stationed in Afghanistan. And they are also asking NATO to contribute. There are already about 40,000 NATO forces, non-American NATO partners who are there. The last 8 years has also been an effort on the part of international community to build the Afghan security forces. The attempt, of course, is, and we have heard this earlier in regards to Vietnam. There it was Vietnamizing the war, here it's Afghanizing the war. So they have trained, or at least put on pay, some 250,000 men. And the hope and expectation, especially on the part of General McChrystal, is that this number should be raised to somewhere close to 400,000 men in arms. That in itself is mind-boggling, because it would, some estimates are that annual cost, or no, a 10-year cost, even after this force has been put together, would be somewhere in the $20 billion range to maintain it. In Afghanistan's total government budget does not even reach $1 billion right now. And in the next 5, 10, 20 years, it may not even double. So it is unsustainable. What you're talking about is essentially to, for the Americans and the international community to stay in task for a very long time. So it's not surprising that you, I, and people in the media are asking very, very difficult questions that have not been asked. Is it worth it? Is it worth the money and worth the blood of young Americans to fight in Afghanistan and to carry this war? There are those who are arguing that it's not worth it, simply because we don't have much interest in that country. There is no oil, there is no gas, there is no particular supposedly strategic interest to care about. So why spend all this money and lives there? I don't necessarily agree with that kind of argumentation. And those who are supporting the war, they're saying, if we don't secure Afghanistan, then America will suffer perhaps another 9/11 kind of event, or more of those, and that Al-Qaeda and other extremists will find a safe haven there, and they'll keep fighting us from there, and so on. And that we must stay not so much for the Afghans, but for our own security. If this is also the reason, I think it's not acceptable reason. If this is the fear that we have, it's possible that Al-Qaeda may not need a safe haven to attack us. They already have a few other alternative places where they have found safe places in Somalia, in Sudan, certainly in Pakistan. And they may be, in other places. Or not only that, 9/11 was not really planned out of Kabul. It was planned in Hamburg, Germany, primarily. So that argument of, safeguarding this place so that they do not have safe haven may not quite work out. But there is something that we have to take seriously, and that we often don't hear in the discussions, and that is America was involved in supporting the Afghan war in the 1980s against the Soviet Union. The Cold War that ended successfully for the West, in part, was probably due to the war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And we spent, by some estimates, somewhere between $3 to $4 billion during that decade, funding that war, not directly but indirectly through ISI, the Pakistani intelligence service. But when that war ended in '89 and the Soviets left the country, United States of America literally abandoned Afghanistan and didn't give a damn about what was going on. And that's when the neighboring countries, Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and others moved in and created a horrible proxy war situation where the Kabul city was destroyed, the country was, again, messed up, especially in the areas of infrastructure and so forth. So we do have a moral obligation as a country. If we do it, and if there is any reason to do it, it has to be on moral basis, in moral grounds. That we owe the people of Afghanistan, especially this time around, after 9/11, when we went there promising the people of Afghanistan that we came back, regretting that we had left and ignored you and so on. And this time we're going to deliver something, and that is peace, security, and democracy. And if we fail in this, it's going to cost us a huge amount. On top of that, if we succeed in Afghanistan, we certainly will have other strategic advantages there. After all, Afghanistan is located very right at the center of a lot of other areas of interest to the United States. China shares border with Afghanistan. It's a rising power, economically, politically, in every way. India is not very far, another rising Asian power. Russia, further up north. Iran on the west. All of these countries are important to the United States of America. Our presence and success in Afghanistan certainly would be also of value to strategic interests of this country, if Afghanistan itself may not be. The question, I think, the second question that is being raised is policy questions. What should we do in Afghanistan now that we're here, and what have we done? Counterterrorism or counterinsurgency? Counterterrorism basically means to focus on terrorists wherever they might be, go find them, kill them. And don't worry about what happens to people around them. Okay? This is what some people think Vice President Joe Biden is advocating at this point. That we should not worry about building democracy, state, and all of that stuff. Leave that alone. Our concern is to remove these extremists who pose threat, and once we've done away with them, then everything should be all right. That policy, it has been, in fact, what we've been doing for the last 8 years. It hasn't worked. And not only that, killing one extremist does not decrease the number by one of your enemies. It, in fact, multiplies the possibility of increasing your enemies. That one person who dies has several relatives, friends, and others who get extremely angry about having lost one of their relatives, and that they are ready to step in and go on and be a martyr. The perspective of those who fight us is not the same as what we have. We consider them, basically a rubbish, non-human or subhuman in some ways, and dehumanize them. They themselves think that they are the patriots, that they are the freedom fighters, so that there is different perspective. One has to look at those. The other possibility, of course, is what General McChrystal has been suggesting recently, and that is we should abandon counterterrorism and adopt counterinsurgency as a policy. The difference here is that in counterinsurgency, he says we should not only fight and increase perhaps the number of soldiers, that's why he's asking for more, to secure population centers, and to help essentially prop up and the legitimacy of the government in Afghanistan is our partner. And how to do this? Through provision of social services that the government has not been able to deliver to the people. Better schools, better economic projects, roads, hospitals, whatever. In other words, engage in civilian development projects and send a lot of not just soldiers, but send also civilian leaders to go and train, both, of course, Afghanize again in the process of training the army, the police, the secret service, and so forth there, but also to build economic infrastructure for the country. In that case, the question that I raise, and I hope that I'll be able to answer that before the end of this evening, is whether this kind of counterinsurgency that General McChrystal is proposing is doable with the current regime in Kabul. A regime that you have all heard recently, the most recent one, has been involved in very serious fraud in the last election. This is the last of the events. Everything else tells us that what we have, in fact, put together in the last 8 years in Afghanistan is not a democracy, but a kleptocracy. And this is what people of Afghanistan are really upset about and have come to realize that America is not serious. America does not deliver, and that they're beginning to lose trust. And I must tell you that in 2002, the first time I went back to Afghanistan after almost 8-9 years. Last time I had been there was just the time when the Taliban took over the country in 1996. So I went in 2002, 7 years. The extent of popular support for America throughout the country and the hopefulness that America was back there and promising safety and security and democracy was palpable. And people just simply had nothing to fear from. And of course, for the first few years, it was relatively safe also in the country when we, in fact, had very few soldiers. The initial attack in Afghanistan was with a few hundred US Special Forces. The Taliban were not driven out of power by thousands of American soldiers, just by a few hundred. And the air power, and much of the footwork was done by the Afghans themselves, who had been fighting Taliban for the previous many years as well. So as our troops increased, the level of insecurity also increased. So there is some kind of correlation between how many boots you put out on the field and what kind of response and reaction you get. And there is a reason for that, particularly in Afghanistan. It's not so much that Afghans are any different from anyone else, although people are beginning to create myths about Afghans being great fighters and always standing up. And I don't know if Americans would not do that, if Vietnamese didn't do, or if Indians wouldn't do. All people, when their homes and their families are threatened, or they fear that somebody is here to harm them, will stand up and fight. So there's nothing, I think, mysterious or mythical about Afghans being any special breed of doing this. It's just they, like all other human beings, who would like to be free, who would like to be enjoying good life and freedom, then they're willing to fight for it. The problem, I think, here is that my assumption is that what we have in Karzai's government is not going to do it. Should have shown you. This is his election partners, the two guys on both sides. Again, this sort of gives you some idea of the kind of politics that's being played in Afghanistan, and that is ethnic politics. The guy in the middle, Karzai, is a Pashtun, a dominant ethnic group, who have come to claim that they have the privilege and the right of leading the country, and no one else should be allowed to do that. the very idea, especially after the election here in the United States of last November, one should have learned some kind of a lesson, that it's in democracies, it's possible for any member of any ethnic group who are citizens of a country to be able to rise to lead their country. In Afghanistan, we condone this, unfortunately, that leadership of that country belongs to a member of one ethnic group. No other ethnic group other than Pashtun should be able to lead that country, and that's why Karzai is there. And the story is that in Bonn Agreement, which I'll come in a few minutes, is one of the sort of core problems that brought about today's events in Afghanistan. Karzai had won only 2 or 3 votes out of 15 or 16 people who were voting for the future leadership of the country. The person who had the highest vote, about 13 votes, is sitting in San Diego still, and nobody has heard of his name. And he did not get to be the transitional leader of Afghanistan. Why? He was a monarchist. He in fact had supported monarchy and maybe was hoping to even return the monarchy, but he himself did not want to be a monarch. He happened not to be a Pashtun. He was in Uzbek, a Turkic-speaking person who had in fact given his identity up. He did not want to be identified as Uzbek. He had changed his name because his name was identifiable to be a non-Pashtun. He had changed his name so that people could not tell him that he comes from that particular ethnic group. On top of all of those things, he was not acceptable to the Americans, to the Europeans, and that they played ethnic politics and promoted ethnic politics in Afghanistan. So what does Mr. Karzai do? He then chooses his vice too. The constitution also allows in Afghanistan for 2. In the first few years, they had 4 vice presidents. 4 vice presidents, just titles, no power. And each of them came from one of the ethnic groups. One of my cousins, in fact, was one of those 4 vice presidents for the first 2-3 years of the Karzai's administration. Then the constitution reduced it to 2. So the guy on the right side of the screen is a real scumbag. And I mean that. He happens to be a Tajik, and he is brought in so that he could deliver the Tajik vote. And I know for a fact that this guy does not have popular support amongst the Tajiks. But he has a lot of lethal power in his hand. He has a private security, several private security firms that are condoned and armed and ready and maybe responsible for a lot of insecurity in Kabul and everywhere else. But he is one of the vice presidential candidates. This gentleman on the left is a Hazara, who also has probably less popular support than many other Hazara leaders in Afghanistan yet. So you sort of begin to see that one of the key issues, one of the key problems in this country, in Afghanistan, I mean, is politicization of identities, politicization of ethnicity and tribal structure and so forth. And that's just the beginning. Let me sort of go back to President Obama. What was he promising? And I have to admit that I wasn't happy with President George Bush's policies during his entire 8 years of being in office and pursuing this war. But I personally was hopeful that President Obama will do something different and change. There are certainly some changes, and we have to give him credit for that. But on the whole, I think his policies have not departed substantially from what has been done for the last 8 years. He has not yet decided. We're still hoping that he has another 2-3 weeks, according to some of his own administration officials, to make a decision about General McChrystal's proposals and so forth. As to how that comes out, we have to wait. But I'm not terribly hopeful, given the direction that things are going. In his time when he was candidate, we all remember that he was saying Iraq is the wrong war. He had not voted for it. But Afghanistan is war of necessity. And the assumption was we have to let Iraq go, get the soldiers from there, take them to Afghanistan, and expand the war in Afghanistan. I, as a citizen, have voted a number of times, but I've never, ever given any candidate a penny. This year, or last year, I should say, I actually made contributions to President Obama's campaign and went out and worked for him on the streets and knocking doors and so forth. Not because of what he was saying then, but because I was hoping that he is a smart man, he's a man of conscience, that he would eventually come around and see that the policy of war in Afghanistan, getting out of Iraq and going to Afghanistan, is not going to do the job. Not in Afghanistan, not anywhere else. Because this is not, as we'll see, a war that this is not a kind of issue or a problem that can be solved by war. If it could have been, then George Bush should have done it. It's not the military's failure. It's the political failure in not coming up with the right kind of thinking, analysis, and solution in policy, and just promoting war as such that is problematic. And part of the reason for that is simply because I think President Obama shares, to some extent, and also perhaps disagrees with some of the kinds of approaches and assumptions that has been with us for the last 8 years. First of all, a whole slew of questions, and I've put just a few of them just to give you an idea of what are some of the big issues that came up immediately after 9/11, and how did this country respond to these questions? Could this war, was this really a war of necessity? Is war against terrorism really a war of necessity? Did we have other alternatives? Could we have done other things? Could we have thought differently about 9/11? And what if we had? Could we have had better results than what we have? The cost to this country of national security since 9/11 is into tens of trillions of dollars. Not just the war in Iraq and not just war in Afghanistan, but everything else. It has become an industry or multiple industries just around the security issues. And the cost is incredibly large and so forth. So could things have been done differently? This is something that we know from the very beginning. The kind of answers to some of those questions that were proposed and how 9/11 came to be conceptualized for us by the media, by the government officials, was problematic. Because the questions they asked and the kinds of answers they give basically resulted in policies that have been wrong-headed, that they have not produced the results that were expected. The first sort of knee-jerk response was that 9/11 was a serious national security problem. And when you couch things in national security problems, you really limit what you can do. Because national security is a serious matter. It emotionally charges everybody. Everybody is ready. You have been pinched, you have to give a good punch back. That's also Afghan way. Afghan code, the Pashtunwali code, the code of people who are fighting, says just that. You are not a Pashtun. If you're pinched, you don't give a punch back. So the whole idea of revenge and conceptualizing security was the very crux of that problem. The second issue that came up was, of course, Huntington's clash of civilization. It was not only that we had to give whoever did this to us a punch, but who were they? They were Islamic fundamentalists. Nobody asked the question of if they were indeed Islamic fundamentalists and fundamentals of their religion allows what they did. That's what is religious fundamentalism supposed to be. People who act on the core principles and values of their religion. And I'm here to tell you as a Muslim. And also, a lot of you all, may have gone out and bought Quran. I also remember after 9/11, apparently one of the most popular books sold in this country was Quran, the holy book of the Muslims. The assumption was that the answer had to be in the Quran. Why these crazy people do these kinds of things has to be in their religion. But there is nothing in their religion. The religion, in fact, is saying the opposite. Committing suicide in Islam is utterly forbidden. You cannot be given a funeral prayer. You cannot be buried in a consecrated ground. You're no longer a Muslim. It doesn't matter what. And that's true of a lot of other religions also. And more importantly, nobody can be killed or harmed for the sins of someone else. So you cannot kill innocent people because maybe their government or somebody had done something. Again, that's utterly forbidden. So who were these people? They were not fundamentalists. They were political extremists. Political extremists who had a beef against the United States policies in that part of the world, in the Muslim world. Their religion was really less important to them than their political cause. Their politics defined their religion, not their religion defining their politics. And that is a difference between a fundamentalist and an extremist. Extremist religion is defined by their politics. So this is issue, a very important mistake, if you like, was that people grabbed onto clash of civilization without even thinking. Taliban had been killing Muslims in Afghanistan for the previous 6-7 years. In thousands. Where was the clash there? They were killing Muslims in the name of Islam. Not Christians killing there. They were not killing anybody other than Muslims. So that just cannot be an acceptable explanation for what was going on. The whole issue of, and then sort of tagging that these people hate our values, our liberty, our freedom, and so on and so forth, was another nonsensical issue. That these people, in fact, like all other people, love freedom and like to have good life and all the rest. And of course, once you tag this is an Islamic or religious term, you basically lose the enemy. The enemy is no longer a person. It's some vague notion, some vague ideology, some religion. And then you can claim that we're not in a crusade and we have nothing to do, we're not fighting against Islam and so on. But it doesn't matter because the reality is that's what people seem to think is going on and in fact is going on. So what were some of the other options that we had but we never considered, or we considered but did not act on? There was a possibility of reconceptualizing, or conceptualizing differently, I should say, the events of 9/11. One obvious one was to see what happened in 9/11 is a vicious criminal act, an act that was also really a hate crime. These folks truly came to hate the government of the United States, not necessarily the people, all hated the policies of the United States towards the Middle East. And that this is a crime of power. It's about power. And of course, these kinds of games have been played in this country. Timothy McVeigh also committed a hideous crime against this country. But what did we do with Timothy McVeigh? We didn't go to war. He was tried in courts. and convicted and punished. If we had followed, if we had treated these people, this, of course, the perpetrators themselves got killed. All those in the airplanes were killed. So who else behind the particular issue should have been caught, brought to justice, and then we would not have had to go through all of this. But that's not what happened. The second model, and this is a capitalist society. In a lot of cases, we try to really explain complex models, complex issues with simple models. Here, one could have easily conceptualized the whole problem of terrorism is a kind of a commodity. And if it is a commodity, then somebody produces it, somebody is consuming it, somebody makes profit from it. And if you ask the question of who produces these terrorists, the first thing one should have asked was those 16 out of 19 people who are assumed to have been in those 3 planes that were used as a weapon against Twin Towers and also in Philadelphia were from one country, Saudi Arabia. One should have asked, what's going on in that country that would produce these kinds of terrorists? Bin Laden and his family, we know for a fact now, with those of you who have read Steve Cole's book, The Ghost Wars, in fact, talks about this in also his second book about Bin Laden family. Many of them were in this country. When all those planes were down and all the airports closed, we know members of Bin Laden family were put on airplanes and sent back to Arabia so that they could not be harmed in the United States. Instead of asking what's going on in Saudi Arabia that produces this kind of hatred, we just let it go. And part of the reason why we did not pursue this may be the fact that, again, it would come back, it boomerang back to our own policies, our own government's activities and actions. And that's why the model was never pursued. And if it was pursued, we perhaps would have come up with different way of dealing with this than going to war. The third model has been also suggested, a medical model. Now, terrorism really is a kind of social disease that affects certain societies. And what are those conditions that produces? Any good doctor would have to be a good diagnostician and ask tough questions about what brings people to this state of illness, if you like. And if you do that, and if you pursued that, again, war would be utterly the wrong medicine. But we did not pursue any of that. The last and the most important one, which is really not given any consideration in policy by the United States so far in Afghanistan, is the fact that terrorism fundamentally is a political problem. These are people who have grievances, serious grievances, and that they're desperate. This is act of desperation on the part of people who do not get a hearing, and they do something, including giving their own lives. And this really relates very closely to certain forms of state structures. The institution of state. We take the institution of state for granted as it's all good. It's all for the better and so on and so forth, but it isn't. It has to be taken, it has to be questioned. Its value and its validity and its relevance has to be questioned, but it is not. And some kinds of states produce terrorists and terrorism. Others do not. And we need to find out what is going on within particular kinds of state structures that produces this kind of hatred and ultimately violence. Colonial occupation states. Any state that goes and occupies other people's land is likely to face terrorism. Repeated, history has all of it. And the most significant example for the last 50, 60 years is the Palestinian occupation by Israel. The current Russian occupation of the Chechen land. They're the ones who are, again, saying that Russians should leave our country, we should be free, and so forth. So anywhere you get this kind of colonial occupation situation, you are likely to find. And in fact, in Afghanistan, Taliban, if you go to their web pages, and they have elaborate texts, written narratives of their side of the story, published in multiple languages, European, including Finnish, where they're saying that they're fighting because America is occupying their land. And that obviously rings a bell to somebody. The second kind of state situation where, again, political situation having to do with states is border disputes. Kashmir, the dispute between India and Pakistan, has produced and is producing. But the one that is most important and least understood and least studied is post-colonial modern nation states. Imposition of modern nation states in multi-ethnic societies by colonial powers in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This is where foreign powers go and empower one. First of all, they create a state that is not homogeneous, purposefully, gerrymander borders, and then they empower one ethnic group, give them the military means, money, everything else, and let them loose on their own compatriots, who then discriminate, abuse, and do all kinds of horrible things. And that creates, so it's not cultural differences that is cause of disturbance. It's the policies of particular states towards their own subjects, often not citizens, because in most of these countries you don't have citizens. You only have subjects. That creates grievances and eventually, unheard, comes into haunt and become violence and so forth. So what needs to be done and what should have been done in the United States policies towards Afghanistan would have been to treat this act as a political issue. And if a political issue, then certainly military has a role, but it doesn't have the determining role. The political side had to be looked at. And this is where I think the case in Afghanistan is so important and particularly relevant. I have to tell you a brief story of right after 9/11. I got a call from the State Department's Foreign Language Institute inviting me to come to Washington. It was probably September 19th or so just about a week, 10 days after 9/11. And I went and found another 15, 16 Afghans who were either working in the government, and that included Zalmay Khalilzad, who became the special envoy of George Bush and our ambassador to Afghanistan, later our ambassador to to Iraq in the United Nations. He is an Afghan American, like me. And many others, Ashraf Ghani and so on and so forth. A lot of them ended up actually in the post-Bonn agreement in the cabinet. We were all there and we thought maybe the State Department has already thought about the future of the country. They're going to share with us some kind of a blueprint as to what their plans are, and they want us to sort of respond or react as people who are either from there or study the country and so forth. And guess what? When the meeting opened, there was absolutely nothing offered to us. They sort of turned to us and said, okay, guys, so what do you think? And we looked at each other and silence. Then I put my hand up and I said, okay, I suggest that we should avoid repeating the Afghan history. We have an opportunity. We should not go back to creating strong centralized government in this country. We should opt for some kind of federal governance, decentralization of the government. I think from 14, 15 people who were there, majority, 9 of them were Pashtuns from one ethnic group. Okay? I was the only Uzbek, and there were 1 Hazara and maybe 1 or 2 Tajiks. So it was already disproportionate in terms of what was going on. And my Pashtun colleagues jumped at me immediately, saying that that's not going to work. The country is going to be, all the arguments about why strong centralized government in a country at war and so forth is absolutely necessary and so forth. We talked about this for the next, I don't know how many hours. In the afternoon, the meeting was called off. No conclusions, no recommendations, absolutely nothing. We walked all out of there and went our ways. And I didn't hear from them anything. But some of those who were there eventually got posts in the government. So the issue is then, why did the United States policy in Afghanistan fail? Basically, because of the kind of answers that were given to the question, a series of questions that were raised. And that answer was, of course, it was Islamic fundamentalism and clash of civilization and so on and so forth. And not only that, President George Bush, as all of you remember, stood in front of the joint session of the Congress and said, those who are with us are our friends, and those who are not with us are with our enemies, and we'll fight them. What that did was, in fact, bifurcate, divide the world into sort of, with us and against us. There was not much room for any shade or color of any kind. And demand was that you had to be with us. And of course, some of those who came and joined the alliance were, in fact, the very producers of terrorism. Pakistan, at that point, General Musharraf had been embracing Taliban leaders in Islamabad hours earlier, hours before 9/11, and declaring that they had recognized the Taliban government. Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and United Arab Emirates were the 3 countries that had recognized Taliban government. Pakistan was saying, our support for Taliban is to the best interest of government of Pakistan and security of Pakistan, and we're going to do it. And then, not even 24 hours after 9/11, what happened? General Musharraf did a somersault, 180 degrees, that he was with Washington, with President George Bush, and he was going to fight terrorism. Now, how could you rely on a man like that? That was our alliance, because there was not much alternative, not much anybody could do. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that we went to invade Afghanistan and with military might and military force, and said we're going to build democracy, just the way it was done in Iraq. You can't build democracies by invading other countries. I'm sorry, it just has never happened, and it will never happen. There is an irony in all of this. You can't do that. You have to have some thinking through as to what in fact is going on. Another very important issue that had to do not just with our war efforts, but with our political efforts, that is, who did we take with us to help rebuild these countries? People who were in Washington, working or sort of hovering around for a long time, who were out of office from either they had been driven out or they themselves choose to come to Washington. A lot of them, in the case of Afghanistan, a lot of them were old monarchy officials and important people who had been basically driving cabs and serving as hotel guards. And if any of you have been to Washington, I have been there many times, and often when I have taken a cab, it has turned out to be one of my compatriot Afghans driving in. And sometimes they would even not mention their names because they think that I might recognize them, and that shouldn't happen. They took the same thing with Iraq. With Iraq, we collected a whole bunch of these clients, basically, who said to people in Washington that if you support us and take us, that people will turn away from the dictatorship of Taliban, or they will be with us, or Saddam Hussein. And that all you have to do is take us there. Once we're there, people will be with us. It didn't happen. It hasn't happened. And the reason is very simple, that these people in Washington had no idea what had gone on in that country over the last 20 years, 25 years. The experience of 1980s and 1990s had changed the society. It had, in fact, restructured much of the leadership, and also, particularly amongst the Pashtuns, the sense of religiosity and commitment to a rather harsh interpretation of Islam had taken place, because the Pakistanis did not allow the Afghan refugee children to go to Pakistani schools. Instead, they built new schools for the refugee camps, which were low quality, and a lot of them could not even go to that. They built madrasas, these religious education schools, which were really not schools at all, but became centers of indoctrination for particular kinds of hatred. And it was that environment in Pakistan that created a very different kind of social conditions in Afghanistan, that people in Washington who went with us to hit the government, Karzai and company, did not really understand their own society and the changes that it had gone through. And as a result, they stuck it out with Taliban. Instead of, initially they sort of, gave a little bit of leeway, wait and see, but eventually they saw that Karzai and his team brought nothing but corruption, abuse, and ineptness. And that the United States was supporting this kind of government there. So that they shifted back to Taliban. And that, unfortunately, is one of the mistakes of foreign policy in the United States, that when we go to other countries, we're looking for clients who would do as we tell them, or we put our trust in them and let them do whatever they want to do. We never look for partners in these countries. Partner, or those people who have their own ideas, who also see themselves equal and can negotiate and bargain and object to policies that are not acceptable. Clients don't do that. They simply, okay, you let it go. So we have not, unfortunately, done this very well. The second very important issue is that the problem of insecurity from the very beginning, from 9/11, came to be defined as primarily a military problem. It was a security problem. It had to be solved by military means. And of course, police and intelligence and all that is the focus, that it had to be beefed up, increased, sent more to defeat the enemy. This became the focal point, that we have to get those who have harmed us. This was the top priority, not thinking about, again, political issues and so forth. And of course, democracy ultimately came to be holding elections. And of course, Afghanistan has had multiple elections with huge costs. The cost of elections alone in Afghanistan is estimated so far to be close to $1.2 billion. Again, remember what you could do with that $1.1 or $2 billion instead of holding elections and every time electing the same guy. Right? This is obviously, there's something seriously wrong when you keep electing the same character, even when you see the results are not where it should be. And of course, the consequences of these are basically, I mean, these particular policies are what we are suffering from. And what then exactly went wrong in Afghanistan? Much of it began with the agreement in Bonn, which we sponsored, again, under the auspices of the United Nations, Lakhdar Brahimi and so forth. The first and foremost was misreading of the realities in Afghanistan, as I described to you just a little while ago, that they thought the Taliban were fighting in Afghanistan and trying to sort of impose themselves simply because the Pakistanis had told us as well that the Pashtun, the large ethnic group in Afghanistan, had been disenfranchised from political power in 1992 because a Tajik man came to be president of Afghanistan, Burhanuddin Rabbani. And that was unacceptable to the Pashtun, presumably. And Taliban were basically coming to remedy this by reclaiming power. So now that the Taliban were removed, Karzai and Khalilzad and others who went from Washington were arguing that what the United States of America needed was to re-empower the Pashtun, bring them back to dominance in the country. And then everything should be all right. Okay, and that's why Karzai was chosen and not the other guy, even though he won 2 votes or 3 votes in the Bonn agreement. There was an attempt to reestablish the monarchy in Afghanistan in Bonn. It was the Mujahideen, the Islamic resistance fighters, those who were in Kabul, who objected, saying, no, the cause of misfortunes of Afghanistan and the coming of communism, Russian invasion, all of that was because of the monarchy's policies. So we do not want King to come back, and that died. But the worst part was really, in terms of systematic approach to the problem in the country, was that we were looking for one person, for a leader, to solve the problem of the country. Okay? The whole question was, who should rule Afghanistan? Who has the right to rule Afghanistan? Not the question of how should Afghanistan be ruled and governed. Because that's a very different kind of question. If you ask how it should be ruled, then you have to come up with appropriate, or think in terms of what is appropriate structure of governance for the country. And come up with something new and transform political culture in that country, and it needs to be transformed. And that's not what happened. So the question was who. Indeed, in October 14th of 2001, I wrote an op-ed piece to New York Times raising this very issue, that we should not ask who should rule Afghanistan, but how Afghanistan should be ruled. And nobody paid attention to it, again, to our own misfortune in the long run. One of the characteristics of the clients, or that in Afghanistan in particular, is that they have become extreme experts in telling the outsiders whatever they want to hear. And it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. So truth is not the issue. They know exactly what they want, what the foreigners or the outsiders want to hear, and they tell them that. This is obviously much of the information that we get. Richard Holbrooke, the special envoy now, I guarantee you, has not spoken to anybody in Afghanistan other than those who had been giving advice to the US government for the last 8 years. The same people, experts in the United States, experts in Afghanistan. In fact, government shields people who may be coming to hear something new from reaching anybody, or ordinary Afghans. So that it's this misinformation, or the information, a lot of it lies, that comes to our officials. And Richard Holbrooke's first trip to Kabul was very interesting because when he went there, there are a number of smaller groups, sort of opposition groups within Kabul. One of them, an intellectual, called me and asked me whether I could arrange for a meeting for him with Holbrooke when he was in Kabul. I had to laugh. I said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. I have no ways. I have no contact with him. But one of my former students from Indiana University was working for AID, and I had his phone number, so I called him to see if he might be able to arrange something for Holbrooke to see this guy, because this is an important person who may have different ideas about it. And he couldn't do it either. But my problem with that was that Holbrooke should have known about this guy before going to Kabul. It should not have been a case where somebody from Kabul would want to meet with Holbrooke, somebody like him, but rather Holbrooke should have made the point of contacting and bringing him into the picture. That has not happened. It's not happening. That anything critical of the policies of the United States, unfortunately, has not gotten a hearing. And if we don't listen to alternative views, if we do not consider those, there is very little that we can do, anything that is positive. And ultimately, what happened was reconstruction became the sort of the discourse, the talk of town. To reconstruct. One of the greatest reconstructions that has happened in the last 8 years in Afghanistan is basically putting the monarchical structure of governance back in place. The new constitution of Afghanistan that was ratified in January of 2004 is a little bit touched up version of the constitution of 1964 under the monarchy. All they did was the chapter on king was changed to chapter about president. And the president, in fact, has more powers than the king did. So strong presidential system became the kind of government in the country where there is so much ethnic strife and ethnic unhappiness and so forth. So that what has happened in the long run is that Karzai, who obviously is a Pashtun and opted for Pashtun leadership, has in fact failed in his leadership of his own community. It's his own community who is not supporting him. It's the Pashtuns who are fighting. And in fact, in his latest interview on CNN, apparently, he has even said that the war has become a war against his people, meaning his tribes. Therefore, he does not want a war to be focusing on his people. So the question is, if these are the people who are fighting you in fighting the United States, then who should we fight? It's not our choice. It's the people in the country who are not willing to support you. You have not been able to convince them that you can deliver. So what should we do? And that, indeed, in fact, has become the crux of the issue in Afghanistan. And I think it's getting rather late, and I'm getting you all tired. Let me just conclude by saying what needs to be done, if anything. There are a few things about President Obama's new strategy that are important and possibly promising some new hope. And one is in that counterinsurgency thing that they want to work with local governments. But Afghanistan does not have local government. It only has branches of the central government in local areas. There is no, since everything is centralized, all government officials are appointed by the president directly or indirectly, from ministers all the way to the lowest clerk in villages or districts. The reason why there was such a fraud is because the president, incumbent, basically has all the government officials in every corner of the country in his pocket. He's appointed them. He doesn't have to say anything because their interest is vested in him. They're going to do it on their own. So the first thing that needs to be done in a country like this is to decentralize and to adopt the very basic principle of community self-governance. Something that this country, and this is one of the most heterogeneous countries, and India is another example, that the reason why we have democracy is not because we elect a president once, every 4 years for Washington, but we also elect our own mayors, our own city councilmen, and then they hire and recruit on the basis of merit other qualified people. So what needs to be done in Afghanistan is to allow for local communities, which are localized, different ethnic groups, different sectarian communities, and so forth, to start electing their own village headmen, their own village council, and then the district officers, district council, provincial governors, provincial council. Once you have those, then they can, like in the national government, these things, again, there is a parliament in the constitution. That parliament also has powers and responsibilities well defined in the constitution. There are provincial councils and district councils. District councils have not been elected yet, and provincial councils have been elected, but they are advisory. They don't have any responsibilities, they don't have any rights, they have nothing, basically, other than getting paid. So what needed to be done was to give similar rights and responsibilities to all of these councils at their own level. At the center, the president is elected, he introduces his cabinet, the parliament gives vote of confidence. The same should be done in the provinces. A governor elected, he appoints his cabinet for the province, gets vote of confidence. The same in district and village and so forth. If you do that, then you really, truly empower people. And this is also the only way. They have been talking about bringing moderate Talibans into the government and negotiating with them. There are Taliban already in the government. There are at least 3,000 Hizb Islami and Taliban people who are at the mid-level and higher level, including ministers, in the cabinet of President Karzai. But they are not loyal to him. And they have their own agenda and their own interests. So it's not going to help him very much in that respect. So what needs to be done is, if we adopt the principle of community self-governance, Taliban could, in fact, be brought in to the political process. If they have support in their own villages, in their own districts, in their own provinces, let them run for those offices and allow them to govern their own communities. But they should not be brought into the national government, or should be done in a very careful way. And the same thing, it should be that the central government should not have all the power and all the abilities to do as they wish. That there should be allowance for some kind of division of labor. One last thing I want to say is that right now, the government, central government there, makes laws, implements laws, and oversees the laws. Okay? Conflict of interest. You can't manage judiciously in this kind of structure. So what needs to be done is central government should be making laws and monitoring laws, but should never be in the implementation business. This is how the United States is that. Laws are made in Washington, federal laws, and then states can make their own laws, but within the framework of that law, counties can make and so forth. But it's implemented locally by local government. So that if you do not change the constitution in Afghanistan and introduce the concept of community self-governance and decentralization and reallocation of powers between center and provinces and so forth, you'll never solve Afghanistan's problem. And you don't need the centralized army, police, and so forth. What you need is community police. Just like here, hiring their own, and have National Guard kind of scheme that local communities also should choose through those councils and so forth, people from their own community to become the local defense units. That way, you can have a large body, but you have to localize a lot of things in that country, because in Afghanistan, what matters is not nationalism. It's valley localism. People really care about their own valley and its welfare. And that's what they also fought. It was not a centralized army that liberated Afghanistan against Soviet Union. It was valley by valley, people organizing themselves, their own security, their own schools, their own medical care through NGOs and so forth. And that what needs to be done is you have to pay attention to the local situation and involve the locals into their own governance and empower them, make them citizens. And then you can have security and you can have development and you can have better governance. With current system, current constitution, there is no hope of improvement, unfortunately, in Afghanistan. And, for Afghans or for us to be able to get ourselves extracted from that situation. So let me stop there and hear your questions if you have them. My apologies for going so long. Thank you.
Okay,
yes,
we've got a couple of microphones here, so, and this is being recorded and broadcast, if you could wait until you actually get the microphone to ask your question. So hands in the air if you've got a question you'd like to ask.
There was somebody here. Oh, you want to go there? Okay, that's all right. We'll let Dr. Nunn.
Am I on? Oh, the obvious question, your solutions require a constitutional change and so forth and so. What can the United States do to induce that? Is it doesn't seem to, it's not going to happen spontaneously or by Obama suggesting it.
Right. One of the things that I think in the last elections and in current sort of runoff election is our government is saying is that we don't want to support any candidate. We don't want to interfere in the election and so forth. That's fine. We shouldn't support a person. And that my suggestion was that we needed to ask a different kind of question. Can we make suggestions about what might work politically to solve and address the problems of the country? Therefore, outline things like, maybe community self-governance would be a good idea. And let the candidates in Afghanistan to choose or come and rally and get people mobilized around that. So in other words, put forth ideas and solutions and ask people to back up a program, a platform. These candidates don't have. What is a platform of Karzai? We don't know. Other than, again, bargaining, going and buying warlords or renting. You can't buy an Afghan, but you can rent one always, is what the saying goes. It's the British saying. So it's that problem that we need to encourage Afghans. And I think we're spending enough. $220-something billion is not a small change. And giving the lives of so many young Americans for this kind of corrupt government and corrupt regime is also not worth it. So if we're going to spend so much of our, our blood and money, I think it would be really irresponsible not to also help out in the solution. We had golden opportunity in the making of that last constitution. And it was also American advisors who give advice on this constitution. Ultimately, their advice was not taken. And that's where we could have said something. We didn't. So we have to be more proactive, I think, in the formulation and encourage. You may not dictate, but you can certainly encourage with this much cash and this much blood that America is spending there.
That was essentially my question. So someone else, you can take the microphone to someone else.
Okay, thank
I was watching the news yesterday, and there was a suggestion apparently on some kind of national level that what we ought to be doing is paying the Taliban to fight for us. And I almost fell over, but I don't want to bias my question here by giving you my opinion. Could you give me your opinion on this latest approach?
I'm not sure who they're going to pay. Do we know who the Taliban are? This is part of the problem. The enemy is so undefined, and there is not one Taliban. There are multiple groups with multiple agendas. Some of them are probably clones of Al-Qaeda and bin Laden type of people who are sort of internationalist jihadists who full of hatred and do whatever that needs to be done. How many of them? Who exactly? Nobody knows. There are also probably very localized sort of people who are angry because of bombardments in their areas and collateral damage. Their fields, their families have died and so forth. They're simply angry and they're up there to get revenge for what has happened to them. And they may not have any ideological anything, but they are also Taliban. And then there are others who might be very much nationalists in the sense of not wanting the Arabs, not wanting all these outsiders coming and preaching or doing whatever bin Laden is trying to do, but rather sort of defending the freedom and local rights of their own tribe, their own valley, their own whatever, and probably a lot of other things. One of the real challenges of this kind of warfare is that you really don't know who the enemy is. And that's why I'm saying that if you allow this principle of community self-governance, and we need to pull out, we have to reduce our footprint in Afghanistan. We really, truly have to pull and limit ourselves in support of positive things and not go into war. I think war and killing is not going to do much. We have to think strategically, differently, and within the culture of Afghanistan, come up with appropriate solutions, appropriate state structure. Appropriate state structure for Afghanistan is not centralized government, where one ethnic group, because this is what politicizes identity. We have to work against politicization of identity. We have to also find solutions to problem of corruption. Again, if you localize administration, people know each other, and it automatically reduces. And if you also empower local people to hire their own civil servants, instead of somebody appointing from Kabul for them to go and serve someplace, they can hire anybody, not their own ethnic group, but anyone else. And when they don't do the work properly or they ask for bribes and so forth, they can be shipped out and hire someone else. And a few years ago, again, the centralization problems are so huge that in my province of Badakhshan in the northeast, a local college, community college, sort of junior college for teachers training, had graduated 54 14th year educated people, probably not all that qualified, but better than what was available in schools. And at that time, the province needed several hundred teachers for schools. But the local education office in that province could not hire these kids to be teachers in that province. They had to go to Kabul and get a letter of appointment from the Ministry of Education to come back and go and teach in some school. And guess what? Most of them did not have the money to pay to take the trucks and buses to go to Kabul and wait there for a week or two and pay additional costs and so on and so forth. So this is the sort of thing that is not understood. That you have 54 qualified people who cannot be hired by local authorities to go and teach in schools because the rule says they have to be appointed from the Ministry of Education in Kabul.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Going back to 9/11, we were in Canada in a log cabin, so we blessedly didn't have the use of television, but we did have CBC. And right after 9/11, Colin Powell, Secretary of State,
Right.
made an incredibly important statement that while there may be some military response required, there has to be a much broader approach to the problems that we were facing. And I thought, thank God, we're going to do this intelligently. But
Right.
shortly after that, we never heard from Colin Powell again
You're right.
until he was espousing the company line. But I guess my question is, that would have been a completely different approach. And how in the world can we get back to that approach? Where are the tools to help that voice be heard?
Right. Well, I'm still hopeful that we may have that voice in President Obama. I really am hopeful that he will come around and he will get us out of this by, again, General McChrystal has at least included the political dimension in state building. He's not saying how it should be done, and we need to include that as well. If we want to deal with local government and we want to create legitimate government and so forth, then we have to do something about bringing that in to become reality. We cannot, if we keep supporting this current regime and the structure, all we're doing is propping up really a terrible system of governance that Karzai and his cronies have put together. It's just not going to work. So one hopes that General Powell's voice would come again, I think, to this nation through our own President Obama and the counsel that he gives. So I'm hopeful. Yes, sir.
Hi. My question is, among all you said about the problems that compounded the whole problem in Afghanistan, how much of poverty and ignorance is in the equation? Because you only touched a part of it, because I believe it's a major part in the whole component. Yeah,
there is a very high level of illiteracy in the country. The assumption, I think, again, nobody knows for sure. This is the only country probably in the world that has never had a census, that does not still have any sort of national identification card. Nobody knows who is citizen of Afghanistan and who is not, and goes on and on and on. But the assumptions are that 70% of the population are not literate. Having said that, as an anthropologist, I also believe that not having been in school does not mean you're stupid or you're not knowledgeable. After all, my best professors were not at the University of Washington. They were in the Pamirs of Afghanistan, where I spent 21 months studying these local community that I was concerned with, and wrote a book about them. They are knowledgeable. They know their own situation, and they're also, the last 30 years of war now has really made Afghans, even those who have never been to school, highly politically conscious people. They're the ones who have decided that this regime is not worth supporting. They're the very people who initially were sort of holding back and saying, okay, we'll give these guys a chance, for a number of years. And finally, they decided that this is not worth their support. So one has to, I think, and part of Afghanistan's problem is people who are now in the government, because they have Western education, they have lived in the West, they think they're better than these masses of illiterate people, and they can blame everything on them, and they themselves are, of course, squeaky clean. They are not. It's their perception, in fact, looking down on their own citizens. is part of the problem. And it's not just Afghanistan's problem, it's a problem of the third world in general. Whether you go to Africa, Asia, Latin America, it's the same thing. That those who become political elite, they see themselves high above everybody and everything and look down on their own subjects, basically, because they don't give them the dignity of being citizens so that they could govern and have a say on their own public affairs.
Your proposal to decentralize the government would probably require a revision of your Constitution.
Right.
Is there support for that? Are there independence movements now with the minorities? How realistic is that? Because foreign powers such as the United States could not impose a constitution on Afghanistan.
Well, there is precedent, by the way. The Constitution of Japan after World War II was not written in Tokyo. It was written in Washington. So we did. We have a also Constitution of Germany, while written in Germany, was in fact helped out by Americans who were there. There is that side. I think to your question, the most important thing is if you remember the Loya Jirga, the Grand Assembly of the Constitutional Grand Assembly of 2004, it was supposed to run 8 days or 10 days or something like that. It ran into 20-something days. Part of the reason for that was the non-Pashtun minorities, the Uzbeks, Tajiks, Hazaras, and so on and so forth, were in fact arguing for federalism and decentralization. And again, their political leaders were appeased by being given offers of cabinet posts and so on and so forth, and they settled for some small crumbs, which is the recognition of 2 languages of the country as official languages, Persian and Pashto, and then other languages as national languages, and that they should be also instructed in the areas where people speak these languages. That's all they got for those 13 days. So there is still, and in fact, Abdullah, and again, he's not a paragon of virtue, is in societies where you have civil wars, the general and the society is that the worst people rise up, not the best. Only in wars of liberation you get the best of society come to the top. But in civil wars, you get the worst. He, in fact, was adamantly opposed to the idea of decentralization, but he has come around. He has a platform, and part of his platform is, if not complete decentralization, then at least allowing the election of governors, so that the president would not appoint them, instead people would elect them into provinces and so forth. There is a good deal of support, and one needs to encourage that. And also, I think, the idea that Pashtuns should claim they have the right to be always leading the country, and no other ethnic group should be allowed to aspire to that, is wrong. It's just morally reprehensible, the way it has been. And I think especially after last year's election in the United States, we should have the right to say so. That we don't buy into this kind of thinking. And that the Pashtun compatriots of mine in Afghanistan should also allow the possibility for other people to be able to lead the country as well if they're good, and if they're working for the good of the country as a whole.
Yes. Who controls the poppy products that they have, and what role does that have in the control of the government and everything else in the spread of the heroin poppy?
Excellent question. And poppy is indeed a major problem, major concern. But there may be some things that people are not talking about. You know, poppy was produced at the tune of about 2,000 pounds or something. I mean, 2 whatever, 2 million, 1,000 pounds, I suppose it is, yeah. Now it has gone up to 8,000 tons, not pounds, tons. Why this increase after we went there? And this thing had happened when we were in Vietnam. Yeah? The whole Golden Triangle was in Burma, Vietnam, Thailand, these areas. So there has to be something here. I'm not sure what. I'm just simply raising the question. But who is benefiting from it? Again, a lot of people in the government. Taliban may be benefiting some, but I think the bigger beneficiaries are people who are in the government, including possibly one of President Karzai's brothers, who was written up about in New York Times just a few days ago, as being in the pay of the CIA, but earlier also he was in the drug dealing and so forth. It is a complex issue. It's part of, really, it's part of corruption. Government officials at all levels become involved because this is where the money is. Everybody can get their share, basically, from the local level, at the village, all the way to the borders, where they get crossed and go, or those who are refining them and so on. It's a one other thing that has happened in Afghanistan. In the old days, we had politicians. There was a group of people, like royal family, who were politicians. And they did not dabble in economics. And they did not also dabble much in military affairs. And then you had military corps, who were also not dabbling in politics, and certainly not much in business. And then you had the business people who were in the bazaar, who run economic issues. So you had these three separate sort of parallel, groups doing different things. In the last 8 years, these three things have merged in the hands of maybe 50 to 100 families in the whole of this country. President Karzai's one brother is in league with his vice president's brothers, all the two vice president's brothers, in business affairs, export, import of all the critical things having to do with gas and oil imports, with food products, with important items, strategic items. They're there. And a lot of these government people also have now, one would think with all this military, 100,000+ soldiers, or international soldiers, 250,000 Afghan soldiers and police and so on and so forth, there should be no need for private security firms, right? There are dozens upon dozens of private security firms providing security to these military and police and other units. I mean, come on. What's going on? And a lot of these security firms are owned by relatives of high government officials. I know for fact that one of the nephews of President Karzai owns a private firm called Watan, Nation, and gets very big contracts from international organizations, government, and so on and so forth to provide security. And this is in millions of dollars. So that you can see politics, business, and security have all become intertwined. And segregating and separating them is not going to be an easy task in one way. But it's also, since it's a limited number of people involved, maybe there is a possible radical solution to it.
I'm curious to know if there's a culture of the self-governance units that you're talking about relating to a central government.
Yes.
I have a fairly easy time imagining these self-governance units, but I need some help imagining how they would relate to the central government.
Yes. Afghanistan, at a very local level, the village level, neighborhood level, probably has one of those rough and ready kind of Athenian democracy in practice. That villagers, in fact, even before the war, had parallel power structures. Because the state was always considered to be an alien body, doing things to them that was not to their liking. So what had happened was that villagers had always appointed on the demand of the government somebody they didn't really care who was manipulator, is the village headman, who was often in league with the government officials, and often mediating sort of between the village and the government, and always to line his own pocket and also perhaps take things for the government officials. At the same time, village had respected elders within the village, to whom people brought probably up to 90% of all of their problems to be addressed and solved as a parallel power. These guys did not want to have anything to do with the government. Only when they could not resolve something, then the person would go to the government, and then government would be involved in all the rest. And 2 years ago, when I was in Kabul, one of my old college mates came from Nuristan, the eastern part of Afghanistan, to visit me in Kabul. And I had heard that their area had been elevated to a provincial, to a province, and therefore there should be new districts and so forth. And he was asking me, what was going on? He said, well, my village has become a village district center. And that the government came there and built a structure. And then recently they inaugurated it, and they had appointed a district officer and all of his entourage in this area. And he was there for 2-3 weeks, and nobody was coming to visit him. So he was complaining, telling, how is it possible that there should be nothing here for us to do? No quarrels, no arguments, no disagreements. What's going on? So a person had said, no, it's not that there is nothing going on. We have a council. There is a council of elders. And that whatever problems that people may have, they take it to the council. Council solves it. And that's why people don't come to you. So he gets angry and sends his soldiers and says, go and tell the head of the council, it's such a time, all the council members should come to the district center. So they all gather. So he stands up and gives his speech, government spend money here, there's districts, and we're here to serve you, blah, blah. And how come you don't come to me and you're going and solving these problems yourselves? So the head of the Shura, the council, got up and said, sir, with all due respect, nobody wants to have anything to do with the government. Nobody, even if we told people to go to, there's district center, go to the district officer, they wouldn't come to you. So it's not us. I mean, you can tell us, we can tell them to come to you, and I can assure you they won't come to you because they don't have a good experience. That repeats itself all over. That's why, again, building this from the bottom up, these are not perfect structures, but they can be reformed and refined and institutionalized and given the kind of formality that could help indeed create a governance structure in Afghanistan. But that's not done.
Can you hear me? Is that working? Oh, okay. Do you have any communication at all with people in the Obama administration that you can have any influence or?
Unfortunately, not, I should say. I tried. I had a policy paper published in August by a couple of Canadian think tanks. It was based on a conference I had attended in Ottawa in, I think, January of this year. I peddled that as best I could through Lee Hamilton, our former congressman, and now President Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington. I had an occasion, there was a Title VI 50th anniversary deal at the Senate building. I was a speaker there and he was chairing, so I sort of played Hoosier with him. and give him a copy of that paper. He assured me that he had passed it on to the Security Council people in Obama's administration. But I never heard. I sent it to Richard Holbrooke as well via email and never got a response. So I think, you know, I have a feeling that our foreign policy people have a list of desirable consultants in academia as well, in other environments, and that they only want to deal with those. So if people are critical at any point about our policies, they're not maybe patriots or maybe nationalists enough in a way. So unfortunately, no. The answer is that I have not been approached by anybody. Although people have always told me, I wish Obama would hear you. Or, I also wish if President Obama would give me 10 minutes to talk to him. But we have no control over that. Also, you have to understand that foreign policy in this country, and also in Australia, where I just heard from a lot of government officials, is never based on knowledge. We assume that all policies should be based on knowledge. They are not. They are based on interest as it's perceived by those who make policy. And those interests dictate the policy, not the truth or not knowledge as such.
Though I'm sure we could be here all night long asking questions.
I'm willing to stay, but
our broadcast schedule is only going to permit us for one more question. So I think we already have that picked out here.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I hope this is a question that other people might have asked also. I hear about policies that relate to what we do in Afghanistan and what we do in Pakistan. And you haven't spoken at all about Pakistan.
Right.
And it seems like the point is being made that it's really critical that we secure Afghanistan, because otherwise Pakistan will fall apart, or vice versa. And it's sort of confusing.
Yeah. In some of the slides that I didn't get to show you or talk about, Ayana, in fact, touched on this topic. It's a very important question. Pakistan is critical for bringing any kind of security to Afghanistan for two reasons. One is, unless Pakistanis stop supporting in providing safe haven for Taliban, for Al-Qaeda, anyone else, to attack Afghanistan, there will be no peace in Afghanistan. So you would have to convince Pakistani government to do that. And I think since the coming of Obama administration, there has been some improvement in this area. The Pakistanis have indeed done a lot of fighting against Taliban in Swat. In the past week, 10 days, they have also been engaged in very fierce battles in southern Waziristan, just across the Afghan border. These are good signs. Without the Pakistani support, it may not happen. But the problem is that Pakistanis have also found the United States as sort of a cash cow. We just offered them $7.5 billion for the next 5 years. Every, $1.5 billion a year for every year. What would happen if there was peace in Afghanistan? They have made a lot of money out of Afghanistan over the last 30 years or so. And they are concerned. These issues have to be dealt with. There is another issue, the second point that is very important, has to do with the border dispute between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Durand border, which the British divided the Pashtun, left a whole lot of them on the Pakistani side, and some of them on the Afghan side. In fact, majority of Pashtun live in Pakistan, not in Afghanistan. Although the country is named after them, Afghanistan, but in fact, majority of them are living in Pakistan. So, the rulers of Afghanistan have signed documents from 1893 on every one of them that came succeeded the others, have signed with British India the legitimacy of that border. But once British India left South Asia and the country divided into India and Pakistan, the Kabul rulers simply said, our agreement was with British India, not with Pakistan. We don't want to recognize this border. It's illegitimate and blah, blah. And turned it into a nationalistic thing. There's a lot of stuff about that. There is legally, and there have been lots of studies, there is legally nothing there to prevent the recognition of that border by the Kabul rulers, other than playing politics. The sad part of it is that they only argue on that one border where one people have been divided, which is them, right? And all around Afghanistan, other ethnic groups were also divided by the same people who drew those borders. Tajiks are divided in the north, Uzbeks are divided, Turkmen are divided, the Farsi-speaking people in Iranian border areas are divided. The Baluch are divided into 3 countries between Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. They never take issue on those. Those are accepted. Not only that, the northern borders for 70 years actually was barbed wired. So people could not go across the border at all. Whereas the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan is porous as anything. People going back. So in effect, it's a legitimately accepted border. But politically, they don't do. And that needs to be settled. And the United States needs to, in fact, encourage that to happen. Because one of Pakistan's fears is that, you know, on one side they have dispute with India, on the other with Afghanistan. So they were hoping they could get a government in Kabul that would be basically towing their line, and then their problem, that border problem, would be solved. That hasn't happened, and I hope it will never happen. But the solution is basically to make that agreement final. And then you don't have to worry about it. At least Pakistanis would have less to be concerned about. Okay? Well, thank you so very, very much for your patience, for being here, and everything.